Welcome to the latest edition of the Stephen A. Smith Show, coming at you over the digital airwaves of YouTube and, of course, iHeartRadio. As always, I want to take a moment to thank my subscribers and followers. We've now eclipsed over 849,000 subscribers, and we continue to climb each and every single day, not to mention the over 3 million downloads that have occurred on iHeartRadio. Can't thank y'all for the love and support enough. Always eternally grateful for it. Please know that. Please know that. On this particular day, if I seem a bit melancholy, if not downright sad, it's because of where we're getting started with some news out of Missouri, the state of Missouri, where the state executed a man whose murder conviction was questioned by a number of people, including the prosecutor himself. The victim's family also pushed for the man to not be executed. I'm talking about Mr. Marcellus Williams, who was 55 years of age, who died by lethal injection yesterday around 6 p.m. Central Time. He was convicted in 2001 of killing Felicia Gale, a former newspaper reporter found stabbed to death in her home in 1998. Williams' case drew national headlines as his attorneys appealed the conviction based on what they described as new evidence that included alleged bias in jury selection and contamination of the murder weapon prior to the trial. The family of Felicia Gale even asked that Williams be spared death. However, the U.S. Supreme Court denied the stay of execution yesterday, a day after Missouri's Supreme Court and Governor Mike Parson refused to grant a stay as well. The Supreme Court offered no explanation for its decision. However, in the third appeal, Justices Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson all said they would have granted the request to pause the execution. Before his death, Williams wrote a final handwritten statement seen here that reads, quote, "All praise be to Allah in every situation," end quote. This is a very alarming situation. And as far as I'm concerned, any human being should speak out against it, but especially if you're black. This black man was murdered yesterday. Let's call it what it is. It's murder. There's no excuse for it. And I'm going to tell you why. If there's DNA evidence that contradicts what prosecutors asserted that led to a conviction, that's a valid point to stay in execution. If the prosecutor himself, herself, themselves acknowledge that based on evidence that can now be refuted, there should be a stay of execution. That's another reason not to execute the man. If a former governor, as in Governor Eric Greitens, Greitens, Eric Greitens, he is the predecessor of Governor Mike Parson. He granted Williams a reprieve. He was persuaded by arguments that new DNA evidence, new DNA testing exonerated Williams. He did that years ago. Remember, Williams was twice spared from execution, first by the state Supreme Court in 2015 and then in 2017. So let's get this straight. Governor Parsons is ignoring a ruling by the Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court from 9 years ago. He's ignoring a ruling by his predecessor from 7 years ago. He's ignoring prosecutors. He's ignoring DNA evidence. And on top of it all, the victim's family didn't want him executed. Now, according to reports, and I'm about to speak to somebody to find out whether or not they can verify this or not, the victim's family was against capital punishment no matter what. But nevertheless, look at that preponderance of evidence. Think about that for a second here. Think about the kind of stuff that we're talking about. How could you possibly justify executing this man? To this day, we don't have a justifiable explanation from Governor Parson. Because the board that was supposed to investigate the matter and hand down a ruling was something that was disbanded by him. Did you just want to kill a black man? I mean, it's a legitimate question to be asked. Is it all right that you just murdered him? Is it okay that he was potentially innocent and you didn't give a damn because the word potential doesn't matter to you? What was it? What was it? I mean, you talk about some nonsense right here. This is why we have a country that's so divided. This is why we have a country that looks at things in two different ways, because you can't come together on a damn thing. Who can't come together on this? When you got a prosecutor, when you have evidence, when you have a former governor, when you have the state Supreme Court, all giving a ruling in favor of staying in execution, and you still say, bump that, the man dies, and have him killed by the state via lethal injection in front of his family, when a man proclaimed his innocence and stayed that way for over 20 years, and you do it anyway. You don't give a shit. You don't care. I'm not one of these people, ladies and gentlemen, that's diametrically opposed to capital punishment. I'm one of those people, depending on how heinous the crime, and it's finite and definitive that you are guilty, particularly if no contrition or no remorse was shown, I have no problem with you dying. Zero. Zero. But only under those conditions. If there's a scintilla of doubt, you don't do what Governor Parson did. And to do something like that, and to make this decision, it's criminal. It is an absolute crime. And I can't even tell you how sad I am for Marcellus Williams' family, because he went to his death proclaiming his innocence. And he had an abundance of people and institutions supporting him. And the governor of Missouri didn't give a damn. You might be able to sleep well at night right now, sir, because you appear to have no conscience. We'll see how long that lasts, and whether or not that truly comes back to haunt you someday. We'll see. We'll see. Joining me now is Mr. Jonathan Potts, Marcellus Williams' attorney at the BCPL in St. Louis, who fought to stay his execution. Thank you for joining us, Jonathan. I really, really appreciate you taking the time. Take us through the last 24 to 48 hours in your efforts to stay the execution of Mr. Williams, please.
Yeah, there's been pretty much a knife fight that went on over the past 48 hours or so. We were filing briefs over the weekend with the Missouri Supreme Court, arguing it on Monday morning, and then trying to get the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case. Ultimately, they declined, and Mr. Williams was executed last night at about 6 p.m.
Who was in attendance for his execution?
There were two members from our legal team, as well as Mr. Williams' son, Marcellus Jr., who were there to witness it.
Any members from the victim's family in attendance?
No.
Why did they not show up? Are you aware of the reasoning that they had, or a reasoning that they gave for not being in attendance?
No, I don't know why they weren't there. I can imagine it's emotionally trying for them too. But the important thing to remember is that the victim's family was not in favor of executing Mr. Williams.
And why did they reach a conclusion that they were not in favor of this execution, specifically?
From the beginning, they were honoring the wishes of the victim. I want to be clear, Mr. Williams is innocent, but the victim's family has always said that no matter what happened, the victim would not have wanted anyone to be executed. Her husband didn't want anyone to be executed, and her family didn't want anyone to be executed.
The prosecutor, if I remember correctly, had a change of thinking, and they were ultimately ended up being against the execution. Is that correct? And if so, what was their reasoning and rationale behind it?
Yeah, it's even more than them just being against the execution. They were fighting to overturn the execution. We were having a trial last month where it wasn't even our team, the defense team, who filed it, but it was a new lawsuit filed by the prosecutor saying that this was an unfair and unconstitutional trial and that Mr. Williams' execution needed to be stopped.
And they felt that it needed to be they needed the execution to be stopped because they believed that there was evidence that contradicted the guilty verdict?
Absolutely. So From the beginning, there was forensic evidence that pointed away from Mr. Williams. There were bloody footprints at the scene that didn't belong to him, didn't belong to the husband, didn't belong to the first responders. There was other forensic evidence at the scene pointing away. We found new DNA evidence on the murder weapon that didn't belong to Mr. Williams. And what further testing showed is that the DNA on the knife belonged to the original trial prosecutor 20 years ago, and he had contaminated the evidence. And frankly, it prevented us from being able to find the DNA, whoever was the real killer.
In what way was the evidence contaminated?
We put trial prosecutor from 20 years ago on the stand last month, and we cross-examined them. And he admitted that not once, not twice, but 5 times before trial, he had handled the murder weapon, which was a bloody kitchen knife, without gloves. He had been showing it to witnesses, just holding it, putting his DNA all over it, and potentially wiping away any DNA from the actual killer.
And still, they went ahead with the execution. What rationale did the governor give for not pardoning him, or for not staying this execution, or anybody else for that matter?
The governor just said that he'd received due process and a decision had been made. And we obviously strongly disagree with that. He didn't receive due process. What we also learned at the hearing last month is that the trial prosecutor admitted that he got rid of at least one juror, in part because he's Black. It was a devastating thing to hear. And that alone should have stopped the execution, but it didn't.
He got rid of one juror because the juror was Black?
That is correct, Stephen. What he said, I asked him when he was on the stand, and I said, you got rid of the juror because he was a young Black man with glasses? And he said, wrong. That was part of the reason. It was because he also had piercing eyes.
Wow. I'm thinking about the predecessor to the governor that's in office right now, and how his predecessor decided to stay the execution years ago. So this governor didn't take that into consideration, evidently. And I'm wondering why that was the case. Again, I know I'm being a bit redundant in asking that question, but I find myself feeling a bit incredulous and just taken aback significantly by the fact that there was a preponderance of evidence. You've got a prosecutor that no longer supported the execution. You got the victim's family that didn't want the execution. You got DNA evidence that was compromised. You have a predecessor to the governor that's presently in office who stayed in execution, but somehow, some way, this governor decided to still go forward.
Yes, Stephen, the breadcrumbs are all there. I think any person who is following this case knows exactly what happened. And we received an outpouring of public support. Basically, everyone that we've heard from has been against the execution, except for the governor and the Missouri Attorney General. And I want to point out that what actually happened is that the prior governor stopped a prior execution just minutes before it was about to happen, to appoint a special board to look into Mr. Williams' case. And then what happened is that Governor Parson actually disbanded that board before it ever gave him a recommendation about whether to give Mr. Williams a pardon or commutation of his sentence. Basically, he didn't hear the answer.
What was his explanation for disbanding that board?
Didn't give one.
He didn't give one?
Yeah, I think enough time had passed and wasn't very interested in what he was going to hear.
How many executions have taken place in the state of Missouri in recent memory?
I believe that there are 3 executions this year, and I think it's 11 executions under the current governor.
Under the current governor. How many of them have been Black? Do you have an answer to that question?
I don't know off the top of my head, Stephen, but your guess is probably a good one.
And where do you guys go from here? What have you learned? Or what do you take from a case such as this? Because it has to be very debilitating, very, very depressing, to be quite honest with you, to know that such a preponderance of evidence has been put in your favor to stay in execution, and you have the support, the inordinate amount of support that you received, and still the execution went through. It has to be incredibly disheartening, one would imagine.
It's more than disheartening. You know, we obviously cared quite a bit about Mr. Williams. When someone's your client for many years, and you're working to try and save their life, it carries a very, very heavy emotional toll. And when you see that person put to death under unfair circumstances, you start to have doubts about the integrity of the judicial system. The important thing, though, is the reason that we take these cases on is we are trying to build back public trust in the judicial system. And the only way that you build back public trust is when that system is willing to admit its errors. Right now, the system wants to say, pretend the errors didn't happen. People don't believe that. Everyone knows mistakes are made. The only way that you're going to have the public believe that they're getting a fair trial is when you admit that a mistake was made, and you admit that mistake, you fix it, and you promise that it's never going to happen again. And that's not what happened here.
I'm thinking about the prosecutor admitting their mistake. I'm thinking about the preponderance of evidence that ultimately favored you staying the execution. And I'm thinking also about Governor Mike Parson, because that's his name, Mike Parson, literally not providing an explanation really as to why he was dogged in his decision to execute Mr. Williams. I think that what's incredibly alarming outside of the actual killing itself, please don't get me wrong, is the fact that the governor hasn't been required to give an in-depth explanation as to why he reached the decision that he reached.
There was a board that was appointed for that specific purpose. They conducted an investigation for 6 years, and they were going to provide him with a report and a recommendation. And like I said, he dissolved that board before their work was complete.
And by dissolving that board, they can't give us an explanation because they're in no position to do so. And he refuses to give an explanation because he's in a position as the governor to do just that. That's the only thing that any of us can surmise. Is that correct, Jonathan?
Yeah, it's up to Governor Parson whether he wants to explain that.
What does that leave the BCLP moving forward? I mean, when you talk about the reason for your existence is restoring faith, to have a situation where you have so much evidence in your favor and still come up short in staying this execution, where does that leave you moving forward?
So here's the thing, Stephen. I'm a sports lawyer. What I've been doing in these cases is this is something that I do pro bono. In my career so far, we've exonerated 3 people for murder. And Mr. Williams, unfortunately, was executed last night. But we are doing this because we are trying to bring faith back to the community in terms of understanding that the court system is there to protect us. And the important thing isn't that you get it over with, but that you get it right. And I want people to know that we are going to keep fighting to make sure that people don't get executed for crimes that they don't commit. And I worry about our kids. I worry about each other. And you worry about whether we really have our values properly aligned when we want to just kill someone because it's been too long and he's been sitting around on death row for 20 years, so we need to get it over with.
Wow. Jonathan Potts, I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining the show. And I'm really, really sorry for what the outcome ultimately ended up being. It certainly wasn't due to a lack of effort and due diligence and expertise on your part and that of the BCLP. I can assure you of that. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Take it easy. The one and only Jonathan Potts, right here on the Stephen A. Smith Show over the digital airwaves of YouTube and, of course, iHeartRadio. It's a shame. You heard what he had to say. There's no excuse for this, and Governor Parsons needs to be made to account for why he made this decision. I mean, his predecessor decided to stay the execution. The prosecutor acknowledged there were mistakes made. Evidence was tampered with, et cetera, et cetera. There's no excuse for Mr. Williams being executed yesterday in light of that preponderance of evidence. When in doubt, preserving life should be the most important thing, more so than anything else. But that clearly was not the case in the state of Missouri yesterday, thanks to Governor Mike Parson. What a shame. What a shame. Coming up, the latest on the federal sex trafficking and racketeering case against Sean Diddy Combs, as a new accuser goes public with her attorney, Gloria Allred. I'll get into that and more next, right here on the Stephen A. Smith Show. Back with more in a minute. I want to take a second to make sure everyone knows we're smack in the middle of the NFL season, and I couldn't be more excited. And with games being played Thursday night, Sunday night, and Monday night, PrizePicks wants to help you cash in on all that big-time action. You see, PrizePicks is a daily fantasy app where you can pick 2 or more of your favorite players, and then you simply select more or less on their projected stats for the game. Pick a player's rushing yards, passing yards, total touchdowns. The list is absolutely endless. And the best part is, PrizePicks has something for every sports fan. Choose from the WNBA, MLB, MMA, even golf, for crying out loud. All in the same entry. I make my picks and submit early, all in less than 60 seconds, by the way. That's less time than it takes for Drake London to take a pass from Kirk Cousins all the way to the house. And get this, sign up with code SAS and PrizePicks will give you $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. You don't need to win your lineup to receive the $50 bonus. It's guaranteed. All you have to do is play as a $5 lineup on PrizePicks and you'll get $50 instantly. Pick more, pick less. It's really, really that easy. Welcome back to the Stephen A. Smith Show. Now, let's get to the latest on Sean Diddy Combs, who's currently sitting in a federal jail awaiting trial on sex trafficking and racketeering charges. Yesterday, a new accuser went public with more accusations against the music mogul. Thalia Graves claims in a civil lawsuit that Combs and a bodyguard drugged, bound, and raped her in 2001 and filmed the incident. Graves is represented by famed litigator Gloria Allred, who is no stranger to representing women in high-profile cases, okay? Here's a list. We're speaking of Gloria Allred here, okay? Here's a list of just some of the women she's represented in the past. Look at this list right here. O.J. Simpson trial, remember that Scott Peterson trial, Tiger Woods scandal, Bill Cosby scandal, Anthony Weiner, former representative out of New York, remember that? All of that stuff happened. That's who she's represented. Allred represented Amber Fry, the girlfriend of Scott Peterson, who was convicted of killing his wife and unborn son. And most notably, she represented more than half of the 50-plus women who've accused Bill Cosby of rape and molestation. As for Sean P. Diddy Combs, he's pleaded not guilty to charges that he led a criminal enterprise that abused women. Look, I've already been of the mindset that the brother's in trouble. Deep, deep trouble, as in never seeing the light of day as a free man again. It's really, really that serious. I don't think it's an exaggeration. That's number one. Number two, everybody's sitting up there talking about Gloria Allred right now involved in the incident because there's money to be made, okay? And the reality is that if you've got a situation where you've got tape, you've got audio, etc., against this man, it's something that could come back to haunt you. We can't ignore that reality, all right? Then you've got to take into account the fact that him being in a federal prison, him being in jail right now, being held without bond, wasn't allowed bail, even though he's got one more appeal available to him, the chances of him pulling that off are slim to none, okay? Now you've got Hollywood up in arms and incredibly nervous. Why? Because everybody's wondering whether or not their name is gonna get mentioned, and for that, my condolences kick in. And here's the reason why. You could have gone to a Diddy party, but there's a Diddy party, and there was a Diddy after party. And the after party is where these quote-unquote freak-offs were taking place. What if you never went to them? What if you just went to the party? And then you left at a reasonable hour like most people do. And you went home and went about your business and did your own thing. But while you were at the party, you took a picture. While you were at the party, you were drinking, you were hanging out, you were socializing, fraternizing, having a good time. Based on how so many people are acting, you never know what level of incrimination could come associated with you. And here's where it gets interesting. We're talking about Hollywood. So the image is what it's all about, not just the reality. If the image is of you taking pictures and partying and having a good time, and you got a drink in your hand and a cigar in your mouth, or whatever the case may be, but you did absolutely nothing wrong. Optics matter in Hollywood more so than most places. So I can understand why so many people are nervous. They ain't necessarily nervous because they're guilty. They're nervous because of the association and what it potentially implies and how it can be used to compromise their earning potential. That's the world that exists in Hollywood. And that's what makes this so unfortunate. Having said that, nothing, absolutely nothing pertaining to those folks in terms of optics comes anywhere near close to the kind of danger Diddy is in. Joining me now to discuss the latest on a federal case against Sean P. Diddy Combs is Elie Honig. a former prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, where Diddy will be tried. He's also a senior legal analyst for CNN who provides commentary on criminal justice and national security. Elie, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to join the show, man. Thank you so much. How you doing?
Glad to be here with you, Stephen. I go way back, man. I'm a South Jersey kid. I'm from Cherry Hill. I remember reading you in the Inquirer way back, so it's great to be with you.
Well, thank you so much, man. I really appreciate it. Let's get right to it. Thalia Graves is the 11th accuser. Count that, 11th accuser, but the first to come public against P. Diddy. How damaging is this case? Is this for his case, actually?
This is bad news for Sean Combs. Any way you look at this, Stephen. Look, I'm going to let you in on a little prosecutor's secret. We all read the media, and there's two reasons for that. One of them is prosecutors are vain. We want to know what's being said about us. Are we getting good press or bad press? But the other reason is we want to see what's going on out there. You get leads, you get evidence for your cases from civil suits that are filed, from media reporting. And I guarantee you, if prosecutors have not already spoken with Ms. Graves, they are going to be speaking with her now, because what they're trying to do in this case is put together an overwhelming body of evidence. And to do that, you need as many victims as you can get. This is why when the U.S. attorney announced the case last week, he said, if you believe you may be a victim in this case or a witness, get in touch with us. I've done human trafficking, sex trafficking cases like this, Stephen, and it is not at all uncommon in the days and weeks after you unveil an indictment like this. You will find more people will come forward. They're trying to bolster their case, and this could help them there.
I was going to ask the question, what kind of impact does former girlfriend Cassie Ventura's lawsuit have on the federal case? But based on what you just articulated, I'm imagining that contributes to the prosecutor's case against Sean P. Diddy Combs, correct?
Oh, for sure. It's pretty clear if you look at the indictment of Sean Combs that the Cassie Ventura allegations are front and center. It looks like at least one of the counts is based entirely on her allegations that she made in the lawsuit. We've all seen the video of Sean Combs viciously attacking her in that hotel hallway. She is going to be a key victim. A real important question, though, is are there other victims? And if so, how many are there? Now, Sean Combs' defense lawyer, Mark Agnifilo, appeared on CNN last week with Caitlin Collins. I was on right after. And Agnifilo, Sean Combs' lawyer, said, well, the government, the prosecutors say they have 50 victims and witnesses, but I think that's one victim, Cassidy, and 49 witnesses. Now, I said on air to Caitlin, I think that's wrong. You wouldn't say that as a prosecutor. You wouldn't say you have 50 if it was 1 in 49. But it is crucial that prosecutors identify more victims. And if these new allegations can lead them to a second or third or fourth victim, then that's what prosecutors are in the business of doing. You build your case, you try to give the jury such a massive evidence that they have no choice but to find them guilty.
Elie, help me out here. One of the things that I've been mentioning as a guy that was born in the Bronx, raised in the streets of Hollis, Queens, New York City. I mean, you hear about somebody getting arrested. You hear about them getting indicted. You see local police, you see prosecutors, and that's that. To me, what stands out in my mind in this case, the raid on his home by Homeland Security, the arrest, etc. The fact that Homeland Security is the one that has come for Diddy. Could you explain whether there's any significance to that at all? And if there is, specify why it's so significant that this is Homeland Security that we're talking about, where they came after him with these federal charges.
Yeah, it's a great question. So when people think of federal law enforcement agents, they think first and often only of the FBI. But what people may not realize is there are dozens of federal law enforcement agencies out there, and a big one is Homeland Security. I know from my own experience, Homeland Security specializes in human trafficking and sex trafficking cases at the federal level. FBI does it too. But when I did my biggest sex trafficking case, involved 30 defendants, and we had 70-some victims back a decade and a half ago, the federal agents on that case were Homeland Security. So it doesn't mean there's some immigration issue happening, because people often associate that with Homeland Security. They just happen to be one of the federal agencies that specializes in this kind of case. And, you know, the search warrant is crucial. I mean, they had to go to a judge, prosecutors and agents, and show we have probable cause that a crime was committed and that we're going to find evidence in whatever we seize, the phones. We know they found guns, dismantled guns, high caliber guns. That kind of stuff has made its way into the case. And it's one of the big reasons that Sean Combs is behind bars right now, because prosecutors said, look what we found when we went into his place. All these firearms, these ammunition. I think they recovered at various times certain drugs, narcotics. And the phones now are just a jackpot of evidence. I mean, you get so much off of phones now, too.
What exactly did they find in his home? You talked about guns, you talked about drugs. What else? I remember they talked about surveillance tapes, phones, emails, etc. Could you crystallize for my audience, just to as specific as you can get, what they actually found in his homes in Los Angeles and Miami when they raided it?
Yeah, so there were firearms. There were various firearms. Some of them had the serial numbers obliterated, meaning scratched off, which you see quite often. That makes it a federal crime right there. I believe they found drugs. I'm not quite sure if I remember that right. Look, they found phones and laptops all over the place. When I was starting as a prosecutor 20 years ago, you had to pull information. You had to go get the person's emails. You had to maybe get the physical paper documents. Now, you know how much information is on a phone? Everything is on a phone. It's the best possible information you can get. And then I guess I would say in a separate category, there was all sorts of sex paraphernalia, sex toys. The indictment talks about 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lube. Now, look, having, over the top sex parties, they call them freak offs in the indictment. That's not a crime. Nothing illegal about that. But the gist of the allegations is they would force women into these. They would threaten women afterwards. The allegations that you're talking about that just came out, the woman says she was drugged and tied up and then raped. So it all is relevant. And there was, look, that's a lot of evidence to find in any search warrant.
P. Diddy and his team, I saw the lawyers on television. I think I saw one of them on Chris Cuomo's show on News Nation. They were talking about, at least a couple of lawyers were talking about how the argument to be made in favor of P. Diddy, whereas you might find his behavior reprehensible or something, there was nothing illegal, giving the impression that it was adult consent going on. How plausible is that argument, considering the fact that Homeland Security and the feds essentially are making this case against him?
Well, that's definitely going to be the defense, Stephen. As you said, you can see it from the lawyers who are out there. What they're going to argue is, look, he's a sex freak, but that's not a crime. The other thing they're going to argue, and we've already heard this from Mark Agnifilo, one of the defense lawyers, by the way, very good defense lawyer. I mean, Sean Combs has a top shelf guy here. He's going to argue, I think, that a lot of this stuff that's been charged is not a federal crime. It's really just an assault, a domestic violence assault. That's typically, that's not a federal crime. The way it becomes federal here is because we have a RICO racketeering charge. So they're going to argue this is not federal criminal activity. This is a state crime. And they're going to argue a lot of this stuff would have been too old to charge federally. But again, the RICO laws, which I used to use all the time, Stephen, I used to charge organized crime mafia families. They give prosecutors a massive advantage because you can charge things that would be state crimes. You can charge things that are too old. But I do think that's going to be the exact appeal the jury's going to hear. Who knows when the trial is, a year from now, give or take. I think they're going to say, look, folks, he had these, maybe you think they're unusual or unappealing sexual appetites, but that doesn't make him a criminal. That's what you're going to hear.
Names like Jeffrey Epstein, R. Kelly. I even heard somebody last week bring up Bill Cosby, for crying out loud. I mean, all of these names have been brought up. Yeah. All three ended up in jail. In the case of Jeffrey Epstein, supposedly there was a suicide that took place while he was incarcerated. Considering the fact that jail time was the end result for individuals like that, does that make it more probable that there will be jail time for P. Diddy?
Well, I think there's also a warning within those names you gave me. Bill Cosby right now is a free man. Right. Because prosecutors overreached in the way they prosecuted this case. The Pennsylvania Supreme Court actually threw out his conviction. He did 3 or 4 years behind bars. Harvey Weinstein also, look, a sexual predator was convicted, and then one of his convictions was thrown out 6 months or so ago because prosecutors also misstepped there. So a lot of pressure on prosecutors here. But if we're looking at Sean Combs' case, it's early. We don't have all the facts. We have a lot in the indictment, and there was other paperwork that was submitted. I'll just say this. It does not look good for Sean Combs, and I'll tell you why. One, you do not want to be prosecuted by the Southern District of New York. I say that as an alum of that office, but that office is famous for being aggressive and for winning its cases. Just recently, they convicted Sam Bankman-Fried. They convicted Senator Robert Menendez, even though he's the Jersey senator. That office has a long history of convicting high-profile cases. The other thing is, the penalties he's looking at, Stephen, are through the roof. If he's convicted on the forcible sex trafficking of Cassie, he is looking at a 15-year mandatory minimum. And I know sometimes you hear, oh, so-and-so got sentenced to, let's say, 20 years in prison, but then 2.5 years later, they're released. That's in the state system. In the federal system, there's no parole, There's no early release. If you get sentenced to, let's say, 15 years in prison, the only reduction you can get is 15% off for good time in prison. So if Sean Combs gets convicted on that count, he has to do 15 years minus 15%. So let's say 13 years behind bars. He's 54 years old, and it could be more than that as well.
Wow. Former Death Row Records head Suge Knight was on Cuomo on News Nation last night. I want you to listen to these explosive claims.
Okay, but you had a guy named Tubby. He used to work for Interscope. This guy's job was to bring underage girls and girls and have sex.
Do you think Diddy knows enough that it's a very delicate balance, that maybe investigators will want to know these other names and greatly reduce his exposure to criminality, to time, versus what people would do to keep him quiet?
Number one, I've been knowing him a long time, and we was friends. We're not enemies, but we were friends. He's not a dummy, so he's smart enough to work his magic. On top of that, this man right here, he's been involved with the FBI for most of his career. Shit, he got powerful people.
I don't expect you to comment on the veracity of those statements, because how could we possibly confirm that? However, hearing something like that, how does a prosecutor use that nugget of information to their advantage, Elie? That's what I'm wondering about.
Let me tell you my thought process, and I just saw that for the first time. But if I'm back in the prosecutor's office, number one, there's no way in hell I'm calling Suge Knight as a witness at the trial. Can you imagine, right? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, believe this guy. Although I will say, I've called way worse people than Suge Knight as witnesses, cooperators. But like I said in the beginning, Stephen, you're always watching what's being said, because you can always develop a lead off that. Maybe you can say, okay, who could Suge Knight be talking about here? Who were some of these people who would bring in girls? If you haven't already identified them, go find those people. Listen, I wouldn't even necessarily say I'm not even going to talk to Suge Knight. He's never going to be a witness for me, but I may give it a shot or send an FBI agent or Homeland Security agent out to say, who are you talking about? Do you want give us names here, because we want to find these people. But the thing you're always doing as a prosecutor, Stephen, is prosecutors are obsessed with corroboration. You want to back up every witness you can, whether they're a choir boy or Suge Knight. You want to make sure that anything that gets set up on that stand is something you can back up with a document, with a piece of video, with another witness, that kind of thing. So I think that's what I would do with that clip. When
you bring up the Southern District of New York, you're an alum. You know how lethal this department department is. I mean, their reputation definitely precedes them, and I say that in a very positive way as somebody who wants criminals off the streets. You know, it's the Southern District of New York. It is what it is. I ask you this question in all honesty: when we talk about them buffering their case per se, one would get the impression the case obviously has to be prosecuted, but it's already been made in the court of public opinion. I know that doesn't ultimately convict you, but it does stand to influence jurors potentially. I'm wondering, why do you find yourself having to make the case when one would see you raiding the homes in Miami, in Los Angeles, and then ultimately this arrest took place months later? One would surmise you already got your case. It's Diddy that's got to defend himself, because right now he looks guilty as hell.
So two things. First of all, you will, every time you see a prosecutor make an announcement from a podium, whether it's the Attorney General of the United States, the DA of whatever county, they will always say these words: our investigation is ongoing. And a lot of times, honestly, Stephen, it's just boilerplate. The investigation's basically done. But it's clear here, this one is ongoing. I mean, we've already seen reporting that there's new witnesses going in the grand jury, and good prosecutors know your investigation is not over until that jury comes back with a verdict. Now, from Sean Combs's perspective, it's important to keep in mind, you know, again, another thing that gets said at every press conference, he is presumed innocent until proven guilty. A defendant never technically has to put on a defense. He doesn't have to say, no, folks in the jury, they've got it wrong. Here's what actually happened, right? A defendant can just play the burden of proof game and say, folks, they failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Therefore, you must find him not guilty. That said, as you noted, it's very different when you have such a high profile person like Sean Combs. He is clearly not taking the strategy. It's not like him to just say, I'm going to sit back and just sort of poke holes. He's on the affirmative. He's on the aggressive. That's why you've seen his lawyers on TV. But let me tell you, the stats aren't good for him. I mean, if you look at the historical data, 95+% of people in the federal system, defendants, plead guilty. And of those who go to trial in the Southern District of New York, easily 80+% end up getting convicted. It is really, really hard to roll the dice and beat the SDNY.
What are we to surmise from him being denied bail not once but twice?
Well, first of all, as a practical matter, it means he's going to be in. He's going to be behind bars until the trial happens, which, like I said before, you're looking at a year or so. He has one more shot. He's going to take it to the Court of Appeals, but that's 1 in 1,000 that he gets that. It makes it much harder to prepare your defense, right? Your lawyers have to wait in the line at the prison before they get in. You don't have access to the outside world. So it is a handicap when it comes to actually preparing your defense. And Stephen, I mean, the MDC, where Combs is being held now, the Metropolitan Detention Center over in Brooklyn.
Yep.
I've been there many times because one of the things you do as a prosecutor is you're talking to witnesses, people who might flip. I mean, in a secure area,
Yes.
I'm not going to walk into general population, that would get a guy killed.
Right.
But I've spent a lot of time in there. And let me tell you, I don't know if you've ever had the misfortune of going into a prison to visit somebody or something like that.
Once.
I've been to, I don't know, more prisons than I can remember. That is probably the worst. It's the worst federal facility for sure that I've been in. I mean, it is overcrowded. It used to
I
be
was getting ready to ask you, what makes it so bad? When crystallized for my audience, this prison that he's in Brooklyn, New York, I've heard numerous folks say it's one of, if not the worst. Why is it so bad?
Okay, first of all, there used to be 2 prisons serving the New York area, one in Manhattan, one in Brooklyn. The one in Manhattan is now closed. So all those inmates, it is crazy overcrowded. Second of all, if you've been to prisons, a lot of them are on acres and acres of land, 40 acres, 30 acres. This is in Brooklyn. I mean, it's basically like half a block. So it's incredibly cramped. It's claustrophobic, man. When I go in there, Stephen, when I come out, I'm gasping for air. Like I'm a little claustrophobic. It is dangerous. There have been 3 or 4, I think, murders or suicides in there in the last couple of years. It's filthy. When I've been in there, there's been like a mystery liquid. I don't even want to know what it is, dripping down off the walls. It's too hot in the summer. It's too cold in the winter. And just to give you a sense of this, there have actually been federal judges who have reduced sentences or let people out on bail because they've said the MDC is such a hellhole. I'm paraphrasing. Because the MDC is such a hellhole, I'm going to cut a little time off this guy's sentence. So it is nothing like anything Sean Combs has ever seen before.
Yet they've taken Sean P. Diddy Combs, who last time I checked is worth at least $500 million, and they've placed him in this facility where one could argue you had the luxury of putting him somewhere else. Should we make anything of the fact that they've placed him there?
No, because that's where any defendant in the Southern District of New York or Eastern District of New York would be housed. I believe I've seen reporting that he's in a separate unit that's meant to protect certain inmates. I've been in that unit, understandably, right? He would be in danger. I mean, he's a huge celebrity. He's incredibly rich. He'd be in all sorts of danger if he was in general population. There's actually reporting that he is bunkmates or being housed closely with Sam Bankman-Fried. So another guy worth a lot of money who would not do well in normal population. But I mean, the Federal Bureau of Prisons doesn't really care who you are or what you are. They're going to put you where they're going to put you. And because he's got to be in New York for his ongoing proceedings, he's going to be in the MDC. I mean, I guess they could move him. There's some facilities up north a bit, but you generally want to keep him as close to the courthouse as possible because you're going to have to transport him back and forth every time he's got a court appearance. I
saw one report talking about he was on suicide watch. I don't know whether that's believable or not, but based on what you're describing the facility to be like, one would surmise that's not that unreasonable and that's not too low, that's not too ridiculous of an assertion considering the kind of climate he is in. What do you think, if anything at all, they're doing to secure his, that he doesn't have the ability to harm himself?
The last agency I'm going to vouch for is the Federal Bureau of Prisons. They have a horrible record of keeping their inmates safe. Jeffrey Epstein, by the way, was on suicide watch when he died in prison. What that means, by the way, is that this is a person we have some concern about, and there's extra cautions taken. I don't know the exact details, but they check on the person more often through the night. They will reduce that person's ability to have like sheets and things that you might hang yourself with. You already can't have shoelaces and that kind of thing. But it shows me that they're concerned about losing him, that they want to, it doesn't necessarily mean he's had suicidal ideation or said anything. It could be that, but it just means he's someone that they need to keep a closer eye on. But the Bureau of Prisons, Stephen, I mean, it is a nightmarish bureaucracy. I get it. They're short-staffed. They don't have great funding. They have an impossible task, but there is a long history of failures by the Bureau of Prisons.
How much time is P. Diddy Combs looking at overall? I know you brought up the 15 years for the Cassie
Yeah.
Ventura situation alone. What are we really talking about, Elie, when we look at this case? These charges,
So,
sex trafficking, racketeering, what are we really looking at for him?
In a normal case, what you do is you start thinking, where's the plea going to be? Because like I said, 95+% of federal cases reach a plea. And so it's like any other negotiation in the world. Well, where are they going to be able to find a middle ground? I don't see that here. I really don't. I don't see Sean Combs being willing to plead to, let's say, a lesser charge and agreeing to 7-8 years. I don't know the man. I can't speak for him. But to me, that seems unlikely. On the flip side, I don't see prosecutors in a mood to give much leniency. And so I do think this is headed towards a trial. You never know what's going to happen at trial, but odds are, just mathematically, empirically, he's likely to be convicted. And if that happens, it will be 15 years or higher. I mean, he could get 20, who knows? The max is life. But just a little advanced tip here. Always focus on the minimum. The minimum is way more important than the maximum. Very few people, except for in murders, get the maximum. But look, Sean Combs, I mean, there's a realistic chance, Stephen, I heard you say recently, like, there's a chance that he will never be free again. You are right. There is a reasonable chance he's never free again.
Could it be that they're waiting for him to flip and get and point out some others as well, that they're not after just him? They want to put this inordinate amount of stuff on his shoulders to get him to make a deal and be an informant on others?
So that's such an interesting question. I thought about this, but the thing with cooperation is you need two. You need both sides. Sean Combs has to be willing to do that, and the feds have to be willing to sign him up. But the thing is, you as a prosecutor, you're not going to sign up a leader, a boss, just to give you a bunch of smaller fish. That's not how you do it. You want to work up. We used to say you want to cooperate up the ladder, not down. When I was doing mob cases, I wouldn't flip some capo, a high-ranking guy, to give me some soldiers and associates below him. I would flip the low guys to work up. And that's how they do it generally here. So the question I would have is, if he's willing and if he has info, who's he going to give me? If all he's going to give me is his guys, the people who Suge Knight referred to, the runners, his employees, that's of no interest to me. He's going to have to give me a large, important target in order for me to even consider cooperating him as a prosecutor.
Elie Honig, excellent job, by the way, man. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much for
Thanks,
educating
Stephen.
us on this case, man. I definitely will reach back out to you soon. You take it easy, all right?
Great to talk to you. Thanks, Stephen.
All right. One and only, Elie Honig, CNN analyst extraordinaire, right here on the Stephen A. Smith Show over the digital airways of YouTube and, of course, iHeartRadio. Coming up, Jayson Tatum talks about his motivation heading into this NBA season as the Boston Celtics prepare to defend their title. And Caitlin Clark sets another record as the Indiana Fever try to keep their season alive. That's next, right here on the Stephen A. Smith Show. Back with more in a minute. Welcome back to the Stephen A. Smith Show right here over the digital airways of YouTube and, of course, iHeartRadio. I want to transition to sports and hit two sports topics before we get on out of here today, all right? The first is Jayson Tatum, the Celtics forward who addressed the media yesterday as the team is getting ready to defend their title. Tatum was asked about his motivation heading into this season, coming off 2 healthy scratches during the Summer Olympic Games in Paris, where Team USA actually won gold. Take a listen to what Jayson Tatum had to say. Check this out.
I'm curious what you learned from your experience at the Olympics this summer.
That's a broad question. You want to be more specific?
Is it something you're going to draw motivation from, I guess?
Want to address the, I didn't play in 2 of those games? That's what you mean?
That's part of it, yeah.
Motivation. I guess you could say that, and if you want to simplify it. In real time, it was tough. Did I need any extra motivation coming into the season? No, I don't. I wouldn't. I'm not going to give anybody in particular credit that they're motivating me to come into the season. It was a unique circumstance. Something I wasn't haven't experienced before in my playing career. But I'm a believer that everything happens for a reason. I was coming off a championship, the highest of the highs, and cover a 2K, a new contract, and then that happened. And whatever the reason is, I haven't figured out yet, but I am a believer that everything does happen for a reason.
I listen to that sound, and I'm so appalled, it's hard to put into words. I want to emphasize that when it comes to head coach for Team USA, Steve Kerr, I consider him to be one of the top 6 coaches in the history of basketball. I think what he's accomplished in Golden State is nothing short of phenomenal. I think he was clearly worthy for being the head coach for Team USA. I think he's a future Hall of Famer. He personifies championships, winning championships in Chicago as a player, in San Antonio as a player, in Golden State as a coach. Had Mike D'Antoni listened to him when he was the GM in Phoenix and Mike D'Antoni was the coach, and you wanted to bring on Tom Thibodeau as essentially his defensive coordinator. Had Mike D'Antoni listened to Steve Kerr, he might have won a championship with Amari Stoudemire, Steve Nash, and those boys out west when Steve Kerr was the GM. So this man is a champion, but none of us are flawless. Imperfections invade all of us. And when I think about what he did to Jayson Tatum during the Summer Olympics, it is inexcusable, damn near unforgivable. This is a first-team All-NBA player the last 3 years. This is a reigning, defending NBA champion. And a month later, he was riding the bench for Team USA. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, not only was he riding the bench, it was in favor of 2 dudes who spend 82 games a year deferring to him and Drew Holiday, okay, and Derek White. They defer to him. How are you going to play them, but you can't find time for Jayson Tatum, who's 6'9", got a handle, got a shot, can defend, can flat out ball? I'm not telling you that he should have averaged 20 or 30 minutes. LeBron James was phenomenal. Steph Curry was phenomenal the last 2 games, the semifinals and the gold medal game. I get all of that. Anthony Edwards was balling. The Bam Adebayos, the Joel Embiids of the world, everybody. Drew Holiday and Derek White played well. I get all of that. I'm just saying, you can't find minutes for Jayson Tatum? Really? And then you go up to him before the Serbia game, a game in which you won by 26 points, and you tell him, I may not be able to find time for you before the game? It's unforgivable. It's unforgivable. And I don't care what anybody says. I'm glad that Steve Kerr ain't going to be coaching Team USA in 2028 because I think Jayson Tatum is going to be on that team. But if Jayson Tatum never wanted to see this man again, if he never wanted to talk to this man again, I couldn't blame him. Because how do you justify not playing him at all and basically telling him before the game you were going to be hard-pressed to find time for him? You didn't know how everybody else was going to play. It's one thing to make game-time decisions where it's in the throes of action and all of a sudden Serbia got you in a hole in the semifinals and you don't know what to do, and so you stick with a lineup and you don't play somebody. I get that part. How the hell do you go to Jayson Tatum before tip-off and tell him, I don't know if I'm going to be able to find time for you? I don't understand that. I ain't going to even get into how I feel about Jaylen Brown not even being on the damn team. Well, what that brother can bring to the table. Not just shooting perimeter jump shots, not just shooting threes, but his athleticism, his fervor, his passion, the way he attacks the basket, the way he can defend. He ain't on the team. We know that wasn't basketball reasons. We know that was about something else. Being a socially conscientious brother who's outspoken, highly intellectual and educated and is fearless. That's why he was kept off the team, in my humble opinion. That Nike beef, all of that comes into play. Because we know how influential Nike is with Team USA. As speculative as that may sound, it appeared to be a reality when it came to Jaylen Brown. Because how do you leave that brother off the team? Him off the team. Jayson Tatum benched in favor of 2 dudes in Drew Holiday and Derek White who are on the Boston Celtics, who spent all year deferring to those 2 who just won a championship. And by the way, Jaylen Brown was Eastern Conference Finals MVP and NBA Finals MVP. Really? Really? But Jayson Tatum just showed you who he is, class personified. He ain't going to feed too much into it. It's unnecessary. But it is what it is. It is what it is. Next subject we're going to get to is the WNBA and another accolade on the impact of Caitlin Clark, okay? The reigning Rookie of the Year. Yahoo Sports reports that the Indiana Fever, especially Caitlin Clark, drew the most viewers for a WNBA playoff game in over 20 years at 1.8 million on ABC. Only 2 WNBA Finals games, going back to the year 2000, averaged higher viewership. All I want to do is use this as an opportunity to highlight the missed opportunities that took place. See, there's a lot of fallout from the imminent greatness of Caitlin Clark. Number one, Team USA, they should have had her on that team. There's a reason why other teams were drawing more of a crowd than Caitlin Clark during the Summer Olympic Games. They were drawing, those teams were drawing more of a crowd than Team USA because Team USA decided to leave Caitlin Clark home. Don't give me, oh, it should go to just the best players. There's plenty of teams that we could look at and the best player wasn't necessarily on the team. Secondly, you were cowering. Listen, you've been craving attention, more eyeballs, et cetera, et cetera. What happened? You got Caitlin Clark out there. And Caitlin Clark is out there, and lo and behold, what is the deal? It is a situation where somebody like a Caitlin Clark is drawing eyeballs. It would have elevated the profile of women's basketball the world over. It was an opportunity for women's basketball to achieve what it has been clamoring for ages. You missed that. We get into Cheryl Swoops. We already talked about that on this show. A superstar female basketball player for years, the first with her own signature shoe back in the 90s. A champion on every level. Now an analyst in the game. Refusing or showing flagrant resistance to giving Caitlin Clark the shine that she deserved months ago. Clearly because you wanted others to get their shine and you felt they were being left behind because of everybody fawning over Caitlin Clark. But you didn't see the big picture. Cynthia Cooper had to tell you that. Nancy Lieberman had to tell you what the big picture was. So that was fallout from the whole Caitlin Clark arrival and her imminent stardom. And now here we are yet again. We saw viewerships during the Final Four in the NCAA tournament leading into the Final Four. We saw viewership numbers blow out the charts for the WNBA draft. We saw it elevate even more for the opener to their season, to WNBA All-Star Weekend in Phoenix, Arizona. And then we saw the numbers where they were drawing more of a crowd than the Indiana Pacers of the NBA in some cases. The viewership. And now we heard about the 1.8 million. By the way, that 1.8 million was on Sunday. NFL Sunday. And this woman, this young lady, drew 1.8 million viewers on a football Sunday. Think about that. Dallas was playing the Baltimore Ravens. Pittsburgh Steelers was going en route to going undefeated. Houston was getting stomped by the Vikings. Caleb Williams in Chicago was struggling. Seattle was going undefeated. Philadelphia had beat the Saints. Patrick Mahomes found a way to beat Atlanta. Everywhere you turn, NFL action is fantastic. But 1.8 million viewers say, we're going to watch Caitlin Clark. The WNBA. I know you don't want to say rather, your boy Stephen A was right. You don't have to. He knows. He knows. Finally, before I get on out of here for the day, I wanted to take a moment to send heartfelt congratulations to my friend, my buddy, and colleague, the one and only Elie K. Williams, host of Equal Justice with Judge Elie K. Williams, on the birth of a daughter, Liberty Alexandria Williams, who was born in New York in August. Elie K. Williams is a beautiful, brilliant woman who has blessed us with her presence right here on this show, sitting right on that couch over there with me months ago. When she was here, she was pregnant. You see her there right here. And I knew she was expecting and what have you. And she's a very, very private person, but it's something that was very, very important for her. She's always, always wanted a beautiful child, and she has it now. Very, very few people in this world, we might wish for them to have happiness and joy. But some people actually do deserve it more than others because of who they are, the way they act, the way they conduct themselves, and what they stand for. That would be her. She is absolutely wonderful. And I congratulate her on behalf of everybody here associated with the Stephen A. Smith Show, and of course me personally, who's known her for years. This was everything to her. It's all she's ever wanted. And she has it now. I'm so happy for you. All the best. God bless to you and your beautiful daughter. That's it for today's edition of the Stephen A. Smith Show. I'll holler at y'all in a couple of days. Until next time, everybody. Peace and love.